Hello everyone, welcome to Star Psych, and today I want to talk about the idea of whether or not intuitive types are actually rarer than sensing types. So the old MBTI statistics manuals tended to show that when people tested with the formal MBTI assessment, that intuitive types were statistically significantly more rare in results than the sensing types. And I think that's led to a little bit of a misunderstanding of how we interpret and view personality types culturally and globally because we think that intuitive types are rarer or less common than sensing types. But I actually think that these statistics may have been a bit archaic in the method in which they were attempting to measure cognitive type and therefore are not truly reflective of the personality type population, essentially. And that's what I want to talk about today. Let's get into it. One thing we have to keep in mind when we're looking at anything related to the statistics with the MBTI formal assessment is that the MBTI formal assessment does not measure cognitive functions in any shape or form. It strictly measures the dichotomies, and these dichotomies are said to point you towards your type, which will then give you your cognitive functions. It's not inherently measuring the functions itself. So if someone scores an intuitive preference on the MBTI assessment, even if they're a type like an INFJ, they might not actually be an INFJ or type with intuitive dominant preference. They're just going to have a preference for the categories that we associate with intuition, or the things that we associate with intuition within that category. The issue with this then becomes when you're using this type of measurement on a larger scale, you're no longer measuring an intuitive dominant type or an intuitive type of thing in the same way because you're not measuring which types actually use these functions in the top two slots, and therefore it might be easy to misrepresent what you're attempting to measure statistically. One thing you have to think of is, well, think of cultural values when these population samples were being normed, which would be the 70s, 80s, 90s, sometimes even earlier if you're looking at the earlier models. Well, things tended to be, more conservative back in those days. People held more conservative ideals and values, and they were more likely to associate with things like tradition, especially here in America, where for a long time, things like tradition were strongly kind of rooted in the society and the culture. And I think that these things could have lent people towards picking things that were more representative of the sensing selection on these assessments. And therefore, we might actually have people who were strongly intuitive as well, who just aligned with their cultural values decently and may not have actually picked things that were going to be naturally intuitive on the assessment. When you look at intuition from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense why intuition might be more rare for humans as a species, but I don't think that the split is as large as we have found in the statistics, which tends to support the idea that it's like a 70 sensing, 30 intuition split. In my opinion, it's probably closer to 60-40 or even like 55-45. I don't think the split is that drastic, especially now that we have the internet, which the internet has allowed the intuitive type to kind of come out of their shell. So as I mentioned before, if you look at intuition from an evolutionary standpoint, you can really see why it might make sense for an intuitive type to be rare. So it's dangerous to leave the camp to go out in search of new things. So if you're a caveman, for example, and you have a nice steady society, you've got little wooden walls up around, animals can't get in, why would you leave the camp to go search for new things if you have safety and everything you need within those walls? Well, the answer is if you're an intuitive type, you're more likely to get drastically bored or stressed if you're forced to be doing the same thing day in and day out. You're going to be the ones who don't like routine. You don't like to make sure that you're maintaining what you already have. You're bothered almost by too much stability. And therefore, the intuitive type is more likely to kind of leave the camp and go and search for something new, which also means they're far more likely to get eaten by an animal. They're far more likely to die. So for me, it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint that the intuitive type is rare because it's like having a spy or a messenger that you're sending out to go explore some uncharted territory. These people are inherently going to be at more risk if they're actually doing that, and they're going to die off more likely, and therefore you don't want as many of them in your kind of species as a collective. Everything changed, though, with the dawn of the internet over the past 20 to 30 years. And the internet is such a huge and important thing for the intuitive preference types. And it's because I think it is what allows them to naturally come out of their shell. But more importantly than that, the internet allows intuitives to be interested in intuitive things and work on ideas in a way that is not dangerous to them. Essentially, they no longer have to leave the camp to search for new things or new ideas. They can do so within the comfort of their own home. And therefore, I think we're really seeing intuitives come out of their shell and really start to express themselves and the things that they're interested in, because there's no longer any real risk in doing so. They can naturally be themselves and be interested in the things that they want to work on. And to me, you can really see this in the fact that we have a lot of inventives and creatives over the past 20 to 50 years, people who have really come out of their shell and started to work on things that are just out of the ordinary. People like Elon Musk, for example, or even, Mark Zuckerberg. These types of people I tend to think are the ones who kind of fell into the internet naturally. It was so natural for them to be able to explore ideas and new knowledge through the internet. So my overall opinion on this is that I do think that intuitive types are slightly more rare than sensing types, but I don't think it's as drastic as we think it is because of the statistics. And I think that with the dawn of the internet, we're now seeing more intuitive types come out of their shell. And I think if we redid all of those statistics today, we would find that the differences aren't as drastic as they were back then. Now, I could be completely wrong about that, but in my opinion, this is what I tend to see in the patterns of people that I've worked with, the people that I've, done coaching sessions with, these types of things. And it may be just that a lot of intuitive people come to me for coaching and sessions because MBTI is a more intuitive topic. But I do think that intuition is just a thing that is naturally kind of fostered by the internet and the digital age. And that's why we're seeing more intuitives come out of their shell and really start to interact with the outer world. Now, another thing that I think is really interesting, and another reason I think that this kind of supports the idea that intuitives might be just a little bit more on that rare side, is I think that it makes sense from a biological standpoint to have these kind of roles for people cognitively on some level. This isn't to say that you're kind of like slotted into a specific thing for your life, but if you think about how minds work and how people work, essentially certain people are going to be very drawn towards certain tasks or duties that kind of call to them because of their cognition. A huge majority of ESTJs and ENTJs end up in leadership positions, and these types are relatively rare. Well, it makes sense from a biological standpoint that you wouldn't want every person in your society to be really, strong and hard-headed and going to be the leader type, because then if everyone was like that, nobody would be listening to each other. So it makes sense to have people who are going to have diverse roles for society. You want people who naturally fall into leadership positions. You want people who naturally fall into counseling or care positions. You want people who naturally fall into strategy positions. You want people who naturally fall into, things that are going to require attention to detail. All of these roles play a huge part in society. And I think that with cognition, we naturally see this process where we have certain roles that are going to be rarer and harder to kind of get into unless you have the specific cognitive preferences for those types of role. Does this mean you can't do these things? Absolutely not. We have ENFP and ESFP leaders and business managers in the world, but you find as a majority, as a large kind of representation of the personality types, that certain types fall within certain roles far more likely. And I think it makes sense then that certain types are going to be more rare because of this, because you don't want everyone to be within that role. All right, everybody, those are my opinions on whether or not intuitive types are more rare than sensing types. Let me know down in the comment section below, what do you think of this topic? Do you think that intuitive types are much rarer than sensing types? Do you think that they're just a little bit more rare? Do you think that sensing types actually might be more rare than intuitive types now that we have the internet around? I think that technically that is a possibility if there is some sort of biological or evolutionary perspective or standpoint when it comes to personality type. If there is some component there related to evolution, then maybe in 500 years we might have more intuitive types than sensing types if we see that the intuitive types tend to be the ones kind of succeeding and passing down their genes that might be related to intuition. Now, I don't know if it's actually the truth, but who knows? It could be. Other than that, I would like to remind people that I do have personality typing sessions available at my website at sursec.com if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. This has been Asar from Sursec. Have a good one.